Hey everyone, it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen to the story, Zombie Outbreak Chicago. Survivor hides in airport control tower. I never thought I'd be living above a silent city, watching a world that no longer runs on times and schedules. But here I am. The old control tower at O'Hare International Airport has been my home since everything went wrong. The glass windows that once overlooked endless lines of taxiing planes now stared down at cracked runways, weeds breaking through the asphalt, and the occasional shambling figure moving without purpose. I used to think airports never slept, but now the silence is so heavy that every gust of wind against the tower feels like a reminder of how empty the world has become. I wasn't always alone. My name is Daniel Mercer, 42 years old, and I was an air traffic controller at O'Hare for almost 2 decades. If you've ever flown through Chicago, there's a good chance I was one of the unseen voices guiding your pilot in. I loved the work, the responsibility, the structure, the way the entire orchestra of aviation ran on coordination. But when the outbreak began, the orchestra fell apart. Planes were grounded, passengers stranded, and the flow of the world through this hub stopped cold. When the first reports came out of downtown, people collapsing, then rising again with an aggression no one could explain, we thought it would be contained. Chicago police cordoned off streets, the Illinois National Guard set up checkpoints, and news anchors kept assuring everyone that things were under control. But then the calls started coming in over our secure aviation line, pilots refusing to deboard, captains demanding permission to divert away from Chicago, airlines grounding flights across the Midwest. By the time one Delta crew radioed that a passenger had attacked a flight attendant mid-air, I knew this was a passing emergency. The airport became a holding pen within hours. Thousands of people trapped between security, customs, and their gates. Families with suitcases, businessmen yelling into phones, crews waiting for word from headquarters. Tensions ran high, and the TSA and airport police weren't equipped for the kind of chaos that followed. When the first infected individual showed up inside Terminal 3, it spread like a lit fuse on dry grass. I still remember watching on the monitors as people scattered, their carry-ons abandoned, shoes left behind in the stampede. That was 2 years ago. Now the airport is a graveyard of metal and silence. The jet bridges dangle uselessly. Most of the planes still sit parked in long rows, their white bodies streaked with rust and grime, their tails casting long shadows in the evening sun. Some were stripped for fuel and parts long ago. Others are sealed tombs that I refuse to approach. I live in the tower because it's the only place I ever felt a sense of control. It stands almost 300 feet above the ground, with narrow stairs that make it easy to defend. The glass walls give me a full view of the airfield, and the old ATC consoles still work enough to provide light when I rig them to car batteries. I scavenged solar panels from a maintenance hangar months ago, and with enough wiring, I managed to keep a fridge running, a few radios, and most importantly, the lighting system that turns the tower into a small beacon. Sometimes I keep the lights low, afraid it might draw attention. But other times, when the loneliness gets too heavy, I turn them on just to remind myself I'm still here. I wasn't the only one who made it to the tower. In the beginning, there were 4 of us. Myself, Marissa Chen, a 30-year-old ER nurse from Evanston who had been at the airport waiting for her brother's flight when everything fell apart. Then there was Victor Rami, Rez, a former army mechanic who worked at one of the on-site cargo young college student named Kevin Wallace, who had been coming back from a semester abroad. We fortified the tower together, sealing the doors, boarding windows on the lower floors, setting up rainwater collectors on the roof. For a while it felt like we had chance, but survival wears people down in different ways. Kevin lasted about 4 months before he decided to leave. convinced he could make it north to Milwaukee, where he thought his parents were safe. We never saw him again. Marissa stayed for almost a year before pneumonia took her in the middle of a brutal January. Without antibiotics, there wasn't much we could do. Victor buried her near the edge of the tarmac under a pile of stones we hauled from an old landscaping supply truck. Victor himself made it another 6 months before a supply run went bad. We were in the cargo tunnels under Terminal 5 when a collapsed section forced us into a detour. He was ahead of me when one of the infected came out of the shadows. He fought, knife in hand, but there were too many. I barely made it out. So now it's just me. The tower has become both my prison and my refuge. From here, I've mapped the airport grounds, marking the safest routes between terminals, hangars, and maintenance sheds. The Chicago skyline glitters faintly in the distance. The Willis Tower still standing tall, though many of its windows are shattered. Sometimes when the wind is right, I hear echoes from the city, distant screams, or the roar of fire when something large goes up. I try not to think about how many people might still be alive out there, trapped or hidden, waiting for help that never comes. I keep myself busy. Routine is survival. Every morning I climb down the stairs, check the barricades, and walk the perimeter of the airfield near the tower. I search the abandoned baggage carts and airport vehicles for anything useful. Fuel is scarce, but I've learned to siphon it carefully. Food is harder. Vending machines ran out long ago, and scavenging through the restaurants and the terminals only lasts so long. I've learned to make do with what I find. Dry, packaged goods, canned beans, stale crackers. When I'm lucky, I catch a rabbit or bird that wanders too close to the perimeter. The airport grounds, left untended, have become a kind of strange wilderness. Grass pushing up through cracks, small animals reclaiming the edges. Weapons were never part of my life before, but now they're essential. I salvaged a Remington 870 shotgun from an airport police cruiser early on, along with a Glock 22 and a few spare magazines. Ammunition is finite, so I use them sparingly, keeping them mostly for emergencies. More often I rely on a fire axe I pulled from a terminal wall or a crowbar that Victor always carried. They're silent, reliable, and don't draw attention. Every so often groups come through. Survivors, scavengers, sometimes dangerous, sometimes desperate. A few months ago, a convoy of pickup trucks arrived on the outer perimeter road. They were heavily armed, flying, no flag, just a band of men and women looking for supplies. They broke into the cargo hangars, looted what they could, and left within 2 days. I kept low and quiet, lights off, watching from the tower. I've learned that not every human encounter ends well, and then there are the infected. They wander the terminals, loiter in the parking garages, sometimes spill onto the runways and clusters. They aren't fast, not like in the movies, but they're relentless, and their numbers are overwhelming. Most wear the tattered remnants of travelers, business suits, jeans, even flight attendant uniforms. Sometimes I recognize faces from old IDs were once people I may have walked past in the terminal, waiting for their flights. I mark time as best I can. The calendars I salvaged from the offices help, though I often lose track. What keeps me grounded is writing. I keep journals, logging everything. The weather, what I scavenged, what I saw. I tell myself someone might read them one day. Someone who survives long enough to piece together what happened here. Maybe they'll understand the mistakes we made, or maybe they'll just know that we tried. Last week, something unusual happened. For the first time in months, I picked up a faint transmission on the emergency band of my old aviation radio. At first I thought it was static, but then I heard a voice. Faint, garbled, but definitely human. Sector 45, evacuation. Repeat. Sector 45. I froze, listening, but the signal faded almost immediately. I haven't been able to raise it again. Sector 45. I racked my memory, digging through old maps of O'Hare and its surrounding zones. If my guess is right, it could mean one of the old cargo zones near Bensonville, just beyond the airport perimeter. It's risky, but the possibility of survivors, real organized survivors, has been gnawing at me ever since. For 2 years, I've stayed put, avoiding the city, avoiding unnecessary risk. But now, for the first time, I feel the urge to move. I don't know if the tower will always be my home. Maybe I'll die here like Marissa and Victor, a relic among the ruins of a place that once embodied connection and movement. Or maybe I'll find that signal again, follow it, and discover that the world isn't quite as dead as it seems. For now, though, I sit at the console looking out over the dead airport, shotgun across my lap, and wait for the static to break again. It's the waiting that grinds a man down more than hunger or fear. The silence between transmission is its own kind of torture. Every night, I check the radio, turning the dial slowly, running through frequencies that once carried the endless chatter of aviation. Pilots requesting clearance, ground crews giving updates, controllers like me juggling call signs and altitudes. Now it's just emptiness broken by static. Sometimes I think I hear whispers hidden in the noise, fragments of words that my brain invents out of desperation. But when I replay the recordings, they're never there. Only once did the voice break through that cryptic reference to Sector 45, and it has been lodged in my mind ever since. O'Hare has its own system of sectors, numbered zones that correspond to maintenance, cargo and security perimeters. Before everything collapsed, I knew them by heart. The reference to Sector 45 fits with the old FedEx and UPS cargo area on the northwest side of the airfield near Bensonville. The distance from the tower to those warehouses is just under 2 mi, but 2 mi in this world feels like 20. The runways, hangars and service tunnels between here and there are far from empty. I've mapped them repeatedly with binoculars and my journals, noting where clusters of infected tend to linger and which service roads stay relatively clear. The airport is a labyrinth, and every path is a gamble. For days I wrestled with the decision. Leaving the tower means leaving safety, the vantage point that has kept me alive. But staying means rotting in isolation, waiting for a transmission that may never come again. In the end, the choice made itself. When you live alone long enough, the idea of others, even strangers, becomes irresistible. It's not hope exactly, but something deeper, something primal. Humans are not meant to be solitary creatures. The first step was preparation. I went over my gear with the same discipline I once applied to radar screens. The Remington 870 got cleared, Ned and oiled, its barrel checked, the stock solid. I counted my remaining shells, 18, stored in an old airline case with 2 extra magazines taped together for efficiency. Ammunition was precious, but for this trip, I'd allow myself to carry more than usual. My melee options were the fire axe slung across my back and Victor's crowbar, both worn smooth from use. For protection, I layered clothing, a heavy cargo jacket over 2 shirts, jeans reinforced with duct tape along the thighs, gloves and steel-toed boots. Not armor by any military standard, but enough to give me confidence. I packed light beyond weapons. A canvas messenger bag held a few cans of food, a stainless steel water bottle, a small med kit, and a hand-crank flashlight. I also carried a folded airport schematic I scavenged months ago, marked with my notes in red pen. In one pocket I tucked away a flare gun with 2 rounds, not for defense but as a last resort signal if I managed to find survivors. The heaviest item was a small portable radio receiver wired into a jury-rigged battery pack. If I could get closer to Sector 45, maybe the signal would come through clearer. The night before I set out, I sat in the tower's glass dome and watched the city lights flicker faintly in the distance. Chicago was a black silhouette against the stars, punctuated by the occasional orange bloom of fire. I thought about Marissa, Victor, even Kevin. I wondered if Kevin ever made it to Milwaukee, if his parents had been alive to see him return. I doubted it, but the thought gave me something to cling to. As I tried to sleep, I set out at dawn. The first rays of sun broke across the runways as I descended the tower stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow shaft. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and rust, a reminder of what this place once was. The runways stretched like dead rivers, cracked and overgrown, lined with silent plains. My plan was to skirt the edges, avoiding open ground when possible, sticking clay, to service roads and maintenance tunnels. The first obstacle was a cluster of infected near an abandoned catering truck. Through my binoculars, I counted at least a dozen, aimlessly circling the vehicle as if still tethered to old routines. Some wore ragged uniforms, the logos of airline food services faded but recognizable. I detoured around them, keeping low behind a line of baggage carts, my steps measured and quiet. Every sound carries unnaturally far in the emptiness of the airfield, and I knew better than to risk noise. By mid-March morning, I reached the perimeter of Terminal 2. The glass facade was shattered, the concourse inside strewn with debris. I didn't linger. Terminals are traps. Too many corners, too many blind spots. Instead, I slipped into the underground service tunnel network that runs parallel to the terminals. These tunnels were once used for baggage carts and electric utility vehicles connecting every corner of O'Hare. In the Outbreak's early days, they became escape roads for staff and choke points for those who never made it. The walls still bore signs of those last days. Spray-painted arrows, bloodstains turned brown with time, discarded shoes and bags. Traveling through the tunnels was both safer and riskier. Safer because I was hidden from above. Riskier because sound echoes in confined spaces. And if you stumble into a cluster, there's little room to retreat. I carried the flashlight in my left hand, keeping its beam narrow and low. Every 30 steps, I paused, listening for movement. My own breathing sounded too loud. After nearly an hour underground, I emerged near the United Airlines hangars. The massive structures loomed like hollow cathedrals, their doors half open, revealing skeletal maintenance rigs and abandoned equipment. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning the area. A pair of infected wandered near the hangar entrance, one dragging a broken leg but still moving with determination, the other in a shredded safety vest. I avoided them, circling wide across the northwestern perimeter near the old FedEx cargo zone. This area had once been bustling with trucks and forklifts moving parcels in and out of aircraft. Now it was eerily quiet, save for the distant cough of crows that had taken roost on the roof lines. I crouched behind a concrete barrier, pulled out the portable radio, and powered it on. Static filled the air. But then faintly, a voice emerged. Sector 45 survivors request repeat. Request immediate assistance. The words were broken, swallowed by interference, but clear enough to send a chill through me. The signal was stronger here, confirmation that I was on the right track. I adjusted the dial, trying to isolate it, but the voice faded again. Still, it was proof someone was out there. I studied the cargo buildings ahead. Most were sealed, their metal doors locked down. But one, Warehouse 45A, stood partially ajar, its entrance blocked by a delivery truck that looked hastily abandoned. If there were survivors broadcasting, that seemed the most likely place. Approaching cautiously, I scanned every shadow. The lot outside was littered with crates, some split open, packages scattered and rotting. I stepped around them, boots crunching on broken glass. At the door, I listened. No sound inside, only the faint whistle of wind through the gap. I slid into the building, shotgun raised. The interior smelled of mildew and dust, shafts of sunlight cutting through holes in the roof, rows of metal shelving stretched into the gloom stacked with long-forgotten parcels. My footsteps echoed softly. Then I saw it. A makeshift camp near the center of the warehouse. Folding chairs, a small propane stove, bedrolls laid out on cardboard. Empty cans of food were piled neatly in a corner, and on a nearby table sat a jury-rigged radio transmitter connected to a car battery. The camp was abandoned, or so I thought. As I moved closer, a sound froze me in place. The faint scrape of movement from behind the shelving. I swung the shotgun toward the noise, heart pounding. From the shadows emerged not the infected, but a man. He raised his hand slowly, palms open. His face was gaunt, his beard ragged, but his eyes were alert. "Don't shoot," he said, voice but steady. "You heard the broadcast, didn't you?" For a long moment, I kept the shotgun leveled, unsure whether to trust him. The camp looked lived in, but one man alone couldn't have maintained it. Not with the supplies I saw. If there were others, where were they? Where were they? And why had he stayed behind? He slowly lowered his hands when he saw I wasn't pulling the trigger. The man looked exhausted, skin drawn tight over his cheekbones, clothes stiff with sweat and grime. His jacket was an old airline-issued parka with a worn United Airlines patch on the sleeve, probably scavenged from lost luggage. His eyes darted between me and the doorway, as though calculating every possible permanent edge into his mannerisms, a nervous energy that only comes from living with danger as a constant shadow. "You're not infected," he said finally, voice still rough but measured. "That makes you rarer than gold out here." I didn't answer. Words felt dangerous when I had no measure of him yet. Instead, I let the silence hang as I scanned the camp more carefully. The propane stove showed signs of recent use, the metal still blackened from a burn, the canister only half empty. The bedrolls were not covered in dust, meaning they had been slept in recently. 3 of them lay stretched out across flattened cardboard. One man couldn't have needed that many, and there were enough empty food cans to suggest at least 4 people had lived here for some time. Finally, I asked, "Where are the others?" His jaw tightened, and he looked down at the floor as if ashamed to answer. "Gone," he muttered. "Not all at once, but close enough. We were 6 when we started, warehouse workers, drivers, people who got stuck here like everyone else when it fell apart. We built this place up for a while. It worked. We had supply runs into the city, a perimeter, even a schedule. The broadcast you heard, that was us calling for anyone left. But one by one, he trailed off, then exhaled. They're gone." I kept my grip on the shotgun. "Gone how?" "Dead. Left." His eyes flicked up to mine. "Both. Some didn't make it back from runs. One decided he could do better on his own. Another got careless and we couldn't stop it in time." His voice cracked slightly at the last part, but he pressed on. 2 weeks ago, the last 3 of us went out south into the city. Said they were going to follow up on a signal they thought they heard. They didn't come back. I've been waiting since. Kept the radio running, hoping it was the answer I'd expected, but hearing it left a hollow feeling in my chest. Survivors rarely lasted long in groups unless they had discipline and luck, and neither seemed plentiful anymore. Still, the fact that they had managed to broadcast suggested they had some kind of equipment and knowledge. That alone made them different from the scattered stragglers I'd occasionally seen. He must have noticed my skepticism. "Name's Harris," he said after a pause. "Arthur Harris. I was with ground services before all this cargo handling. Maintenance support. I know these warehouses better than anyone alive. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle, then looked at me expectantly, waiting for my own name. Daniel, I said simply. I didn't give more than that. Trust was currency, and I wasn't ready to spend it freely. Harris nodded, accepting the bare introduction. He gestured toward the radio rig on the table. That signal still runs because I keep it running. Thought maybe it would bring someone like you, someone alive, someone with enough sense not to walk straight into the middle of the city. I lowered the shotgun at last, though I kept it loosely in my grip. You wanted someone to come. Now what? What's your plan? His shoulders slumped as if the question carried more weight than he could manage. Plan was to wait for the others, but I've had to admit to myself, I've been thinking about leaving, but leaving alone is a death sentence. I don't care how careful you are out there. Sooner or later, alone will get you killed. He fixed me with a look. Something between desperation and calculation. You must have a place. Nobody lasts this long wandering. I didn't answer immediately. Revealing the tower was risky. It was safe precisely because nobody knew about it. Still, something in Harris's tone told me he wasn't lying about being alone. And if he was telling the truth, then he had nothing left tying him to this warehouse. I've managed, I said finally. Up in the tower, airfield side, his eyes widened slightly. The tower? You're kidding. That place has been sitting up there all this time. I thought it would have been overrun in the first weeks. I shook my head. Too high, too narrow. Not easy for anything to get in if you know how to lock it down. Been there since the start. For the first time since we met, Harris's expression softened, as if the thought of such a secure vantage point gave him a spark of something like hope. Then you've done better than us, he said quietly. We thought we had a fortress here, but all we built was a trap with walls too wide and doors too many. We both stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the wind whistle through the broken roof panels. Finally, he walked to the transmitter, shut it down with a flick of the switch, and unhooked the cables from the battery. No point leaving it on now. If anyone else was going to hear it, they would have by now. The rest of the day passed in uneasy alliance. We moved through the warehouse together, scavenging what was left. I found a half case of bottled water buried under a tarp. Harris uncovered a crate of expired protein bars that were still edible, and between us, we pulled together enough supplies to justify carrying them back. He showed me a side room where they had stored tools and spare fuel. I took what I could of the lighter equipment, marking the heavier items in my notebook in case I returned. By nightfall, the choice had to be made. Stay in the warehouse overnight or attempt to trek back to the tower in the dark. I didn't trust the open ground after sunset, not with visibility dropping and the infected wandering more freely. So we secured the warehouse best we could. We dragged crates against the doors, doused the stove, and sat up in the corner near the radio table. Lying on my bedroll, I listened to Harris breathing across from me, steady but restless. Sleep never came easily in the field. But that night, it was impossible. My mind turned with thoughts of what I had learned. If his group had heard another signal deeper in the city, that meant someone else had been broadcasting beyond the airport perimeter. If true, it meant this wasteland wasn't entirely silent. At some point, I drifted into a shallow doze, waking at every creak or distant groan of wind through the rafters. At dawn, we moved out. The return trip was slower with the added weight of supplies and the burden of watching out for one another. Harris wasn't reckless, but he lacked the careful method I developed over years of moving through the airport alone. He made too much noise stepping over debris, paused too long in exposed areas. More than once I had to signal sharply for him to freeze when shapes moved in the distance. We reached the tower by late afternoon. As it came into view, Harris stopped walking and just stared up at it. The glass dome glinted faintly in the sun, a lone sentinel above the endless flat expanse of runways. "You've really been living up there," he said, shaking his head. "All this time right under my nose, we never even thought to check." Inside, I led him up the stairs, showing the bar, arcades and the narrow passages that had kept me safe. At the top, when the city skyline came into view through the 360-degree glass, Harris stood silently for a long time. He admitted. It was strange having someone else in the tower again. I had grown so accustomed to solitude that the presence of another voice, another set of footsteps, felt intrusive at first. But as night fell and we set up our finds from the warehouse, I realized how different the silence felt with another human sharing it. Not less heavy, but less absolute. That evening, over cans of beans heated on my small camping stove, Harris told me more about the group he had lost. They had made contact with a supposed safe zone on the far side of Chicago near the lakefront. The last transmission they received was fragmented, but suggested a larger gathering of survivors with organized leadership, supplies, and a secure perimeter. It was that promise that had drawn his companions into the city. Harris had stayed behind to maintain the broadcast station and protect their base. He never heard from them again. As he spoke, I found myself weighing the risks. Venturing into the city was something I had sworn never to do. The density of infected, the crumbling infrastructure, the unknown dangers, it was a death sentence. Yet if there truly was a coordinated survivor group out there, ignoring it meant condemning myself to endless solitude. When Harris finished, he looked at me directly. "You've lasted this long because you're cautious. I respect that, but caution alone won't save us forever. Supplies run out. Sooner or later, even this tower will stop holding. If there are others, real, organized others, we need to find them. Otherwise, we're just marking time until it catches us too." I didn't answer immediately. His words echoed uncomfortably against the thoughts I had tried to bury. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't entirely alone with those thoughts anymore, and that made them harder to ignore. That night, I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the solar battery regulator and the occasional rattle of wind against the glass panes of the dome. Harris slept in the corner where Kevin's bedroll had once been, his breathing heavy but uneven. I stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had said, about how caution was only delaying the inevitable. He wasn't wrong. The tower had protected me, yes, but it wasn't indestructible. I had reinforced doors, stockpiled supplies, mapped routes, but time eats away at every structure, and sooner or later a mistake, an accident, or just bad luck could unravel everything. The city loomed on the horizon each night, its skyline like the shadow of a promise. For years I had convinced myself that nothing good remained there. But now, with Harris's words digging into my mind, I began to wonder if I had been hiding not just from danger, but from the chance of finding something worth living for. The following morning, I rose earlier than usual. Routine dictated my movements, checking the barricades on the stairwell, inspecting the rainwater collectors on the roof, and testing the charge on the batteries. Harris followed me quietly, watching with the curiosity of someone trying to understand how another man had endured so long alone. When we sat down for breakfast, crackers and a can of fruit cocktail, We finally spoke of the subject neither of us had dropped. "If there really is a group," I said, "if your people weren't chasing ghosts, then we'd need a plan that doesn't just get us to the city, but gets us back alive." Harris nodded. "Agreed. Running in blind would be suicide. We'd need reconnaissance, safe stops along the way, fallback points. I know the northwest side of Chicago well enough from before. Industrial areas, warehouses, old trucking routes. If anyone set up a camp, they'd look for fortified structures near water or fuel." He leaned over the rough map I had spread on the table. His finger traced the perimeter of the airport, then the rail line cutting toward Franklin Park, and finally the web of highways leading into the heart, he said, tapping the intersections near the I-90. "Too many abandoned vehicles. Better to skirt through side roads, but we'd need to move carefully. Noise carries in those concrete corridors." As he spoke, I found myself evaluating him in a way I hadn't before. Harris wasn't a soldier, but he had the mind of someone who had learned survival through trial and error. He wasn't careless like Kevin had been, nor resigned like Victor had become. He had a purpose, and purpose was a rare currency. Now, over the next few days, we built a rhythm. Harris helped reinforce the tower's barricades, patching weak points I had ignored out of habit. He scavenged through the maintenance sheds nearby and brought back useful odds and ends, spare batteries, duct tape, hand tools. With two of us working, the tower began to feel less like a fragile shelter and more like a defended outpost. At night, we pored over maps by lantern light, marking potential routes and debating risks. Still, doubt gnawed at me. The city was not the airport. Here I knew every corner, every shadow, every echo of wind. Out there, the unknown multiplied with every block. The sheer number of infected alone would dwarf anything I had seen around O'Hare. And then there was the possibility of hostile groups. Harris's companions had never returned. That was the detail I couldn't shake. Either they had been killed by the infected, or something else had claimed them. On the fifth morning, after bringing him back, we stood on the roof of the tower. The sky was clear, the city skyline sharp against the horizon. Through the binoculars, I swept across the northwestern suburbs, a sprawl of warehouses, strip malls, and industrial lots between us and downtown. I saw no movement, but that meant little. Still, the silence pressed heavy. "We can't go yet," I said finally. "We don't have enough food to risk it. A trip that far could take days, even weeks, if things go wrong. We need reserves." Harris agreed, though impatience showed in his eyes. "Then we make runs now, secure what we can before we leave. There's still plenty left in the outer hangars and the employee complexes. Most scavengers never linger around here. They think the airport is a death trap. That's our advantage. And so we began a new phase of survival. Instead of staying hidden, we hunted deliberately for supplies, moving further into areas I had avoided. Harris's presence changed the way I operated. Alone, I moved like a shadow, silent and quick, never lingering. With two, we could take calculated risks, cover each other, carry more back. The first run brought us a case of bottled water from an abandoned break room. The second, spare first aid kits from a locked medical cabinet in the old TSA offices. The third nearly cost us everything when we stumbled across a group of infected in a stairwell. That encounter stays burned into my memory. We had pushed into the lower levels of Terminal 1, looking for access to the airline staff lounges. The stairwell was dark, the air stale. We had just rounded the landing when the sound of shuffling feet rose up from below. At least a dozen of them, drawn by who knows what. Their faces turned upward as one, and the sound that came from their throats was enough to turn blood to ice. Harris raised his crowbar. I brought the shotgun to my shoulder. The first blast echoed like thunder, tearing through the confined space. The recoil rattled my arms, the muzzle flash blinding for an instant, but there were too many. We fell back, scrambling through the door we had come from, slamming it shut as the infected threw themselves against it. The steel frame held, but the echo of their fists and snars followed us all the way back to the surface. That night, as we sat in silent as in the tower, Harris finally broke the stillness. "That's just a stairwell," he said. "Imagine an entire street in the city." Neither of us slept well. The runs strengthened the tower's stores. We built a small reserve of canned food, water, batteries, and medical supplies. Harris even managed to repair an old airport maintenance truck, hot wiring it and coaxing life back into its rusted frame. Fuel was scarce, but with careful rationing, it could be enough to get us partway to the city if we decided to risk the roads. The thought of moving with the vehicle both reassured and frightened me. Speed meant less exposure, but engines drew attention like a beacon. Weeks passed in this cycle of preparation. The tower, once a lonely outpost, now hummed with the kind of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Yet the weight of the decision loomed larger each day. Leaving meant gambling everything on the hope that Harris's companions had not died, chasing lies. Staying meant slowly consuming what we had built, waiting for the walls to fail. One evening, as the sun bled red over the skyline, Harris placed the binoculars down on the table with a deliberate slowness. "We've done all we can here," he said. "Supplies, maps, fuel. You know as well as I do that staying won't save us. If that broadcast came from real survivors, then they're our only chance at something beyond waiting to die. If it didn't, at least we'll know. At least we'll have tried." I didn't answer right away. I watched the city as the lights of dusk flickered and faded, leaving only black towers against a darker sky. My heart hammered with the weight of his words. For 2 years, my world had ended at the airport perimeter. Beyond it was shadow, memory, fear. And now, for the first time, I was staring at that horizon, not with dread, but with a grim kind of resolve. "We'll need a route that avoids the interstates," I said at last. "Side streets, rail corridors, anywhere we can move without being funneled into traps. And we'll need planned fallback points every few miles. If it goes bad, we don't push forward blindly. We survive first, move second." Harris's eyes lit with a fierce satisfaction. "Then we start charting it tonight." As he unfolded the maps, marking lines with a stub of pencil, I realized a decision had already been made. The tower would not be my grave after all. The city was calling, and whether it held salvation or ruin, I was going to find out. The days that followed were spent in a kind of restless urgency. Every detail mattered now: what to pack, what to leave behind, how much weight we could carry without slowing ourselves to death. Harris insisted we travel light, but I had learned through bitter experience that the one thing you decide not to bring is always the thing you end up needing most. In the end, compromise won out. Each of us would carry a backpack with food, water, and medical supplies, while the truck would bear the heavier load, spare fuel, blankets, tools, and the lantern batteries. We both knew the vehicle might not make it far, but even 50 minutes gained would put us closer to our goal than weeks of walking. The night before we left, I walked the tower alone. The silence of the stairwell echoed with years of my own footsteps, ghosts of a routine I had once thought permanent. In the observation deck, I lingered the longest, staring down at the dead airport spread below me. The runways stretched into the distance, pale scars across the earth, while the skeletal remains of planes sat rusting in their gates. For 2 years, this had been my universe. Every shadow, every flicker of movement catalogued and studied, until I could tell the difference between the wind rattling a fence and the scrape of something alive. To leave it behind felt like tearing away a part of myself, even if that part had always been a prison. At dawn, Harris and I loaded the truck in silence. The air was sharp with the smell of alcohol, oil and rust, the engine coughing reluctantly before it settled into a steady growl. We moved quickly, pulling away from the tower's shadow before doubt once set in. At glass dome of the control room where I had spent so many hours waiting for static to break, it looked smaller now, almost fragile, and I wondered if I would ever see it again. The road that circled the airport was cracked and overgrown, weeds forcing their way through the asphalt. Broken cars sat abandoned along the edges, stripped of parts long ago, their windows clouded with dust. The truck rattled and shook with every pothole, but it held. Beyond the perimeter fence, the world opened into a sprawl of industrial lots and empty highways. The silence was thicker here, broken only by the hum of the engine. We took the side roads first, winding through warehouse districts where chain-link fences sagged and loading docks gaped like empty mouths. I kept the shotgun across my lap. Harris gripped the wheel tightly, eyes flicking to every shadow. The infected were out there. We both knew it, but the roads near the airport had long since been picked clean. What unsettled me more were the signs of human passage, burned-out campfires, a stripped bicycle lying on its side, graffiti on a wall reading "Turn back" in black spray paint. Someone had been here not long ago. We stopped briefly in a small industrial park to check the map and let the truck cool. The silence pressed in as we ate from a shared can of beans. The kind of meal that in another life would have felt like punishment, but now passed for fuel. Harris studied the skyline in the distance. The towers of Chicago rising like dark teeth against the morning haze. "Closer than I thought," he muttered. "But that makes it worse. The density, the numbers." We pushed on. The truck carried us through the first few miles quickly, but by midday we hit the first true obstacle, a collapsed overpass where rusted cars lay in a heap, blocking the road entirely. Harris cursed under his breath, but neither of us had expected the trip to be clean. We pulled the truck into the shadow of an overgrown service station and cut the engine. From here we would have to continue on foot until we could find another drivable path. The silence after the engine died was deafening. Every bird call and rustle of leaves amplified. We loaded our packs carefully, each movement deliberate. Harris took the crowbar. I kept the shotgun. The air smelled of dust and old gasoline, heavy with a weight that only abandoned places carry. Beyond the station, the road sloped downward into a residential sprawl. Rows of houses standing silent with windows like hollow eyes. My gut tightened. Industrial ruins were one thing, but neighborhoods meant tighter spaces, more places for the infected to wait unseen. As we stepped into the shadow of the first street, I felt the final thread to the tower's snap. There would be no turning back easily now. Every step carried us deeper into the unknown, the city pulling us closer with its silent gravity. Harris walked a pace ahead, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the corners of every house. I followed, the shotgun steady, my ears straining for the sound I feared most, the shuffle of feet that didn't belong to us. For the first time in years, I was outside the perimeter of my world, and for the first time I realized I wasn't sure if I was walking towards survival or straight into the end. The street we followed bent downward, lined with houses that once might have felt ordinary, but now carried the weight of tragedy in every detail. Lawns were overgrown to waist height, porches sagged under the pressure of neglect, and cars sat half hidden beneath a blanket of ivy. Some doors were left ajar, as if families had fled in haste while others were barricaded with heavy furniture. Reminders that not everyone had managed to get away. Every window felt like an eye on us, whole, low but watchful, as though the very neighborhood was aware of our presence. Harris stopped once to crouch near a driveway where a chalk drawing still in bright blue and yellow spelled out words barely legible under dirt. Safe here. My chest tightened. The letters were smudged by rain, but the message remained, preserved like a fossil of hope that never survived. Harris didn't say anything. He just shook his head, once grimly, and we moved on. The further we pressed into the residential sprawl, the more claustrophobic it felt. The tower's wide horizon had spoiled me. I had grown used to spotting threats from a distance, calculating escape routes before danger could close in. Here the sight lines were short. Fences and hedges funneled us into narrow paths. Driveways and alleys became choke points. Every gust of wind through a broken screen door sounded too deliberate, too much like breath. I gripped the shotgun tighter, the woodstock worn smooth under my palm. We passed the first body before noon. It lay slumped against the curb, skin sun-bleached and brittle, clothing ragged from years of weather. Whoever they were, they had been gone a long time, nothing left to fear. But the sight froze me anyway. I had almost forgotten what it was like to walk among the markers of collapse, to be confronted with the undeniable evidence of how quickly life had been extinguished. In the tower, memory and silence blurred together. Here, the past sat at every street corner, waiting to remind you that it had been real. We cut through backyards when possible, avoiding the main roads. It slowed our pace, but kept us concealed. Harris led with confidence that only came from practice, moving like a man who had navigated ruins before. He raised a hand suddenly, motioning for me to stop. I froze, my heart in my throat, as he gestured toward a house across the street. The front door swung lightly in the breeze, hinges creaking. But that wasn't what caught his attention. From inside came a faint scrape, the sound of something dragging along the floorboards. We crouched low behind a hedge, listening. There it was again, a shuffle, irregular, followed by a low thump. Harris leaned close and whispered, "One inside, maybe two." His voice was calm, but I could see the tightness around his jaw. We didn't need to go in, didn't need to risk it. But the problem wasn't the house itself, it was the noise. Sound carried in neighborhoods like this, echoing strangely, luring more than just human ears. If we left it unchecked, whatever was inside might not stay inside for long. I kept the shotgun steady as Harris approached the porch, crowbar in hand. The boards creaked under his boots, each step deliberate but unavoidable. He pushed the door wider with the steel bar, and the noise from inside grew clearer, wet, uneven movements punctuated by the scrape of nails against wood. The smell hit me next, sour and damp, a mix of mildew and rot that spilled out of the dark. The figure came into view slowly, emerging from the hallway like a nightmare given flesh. Its body was twisted, limbs stiff from decay, the skin a patchwork of pale scars and dried lesions. Its eyes were glazed, but they locked onto Harris with a hunger that needed no words. It staggered forward, its jaw opening and closing in a grotesque rhythm, teeth snapping audibly in the silence. Harris didn't flinch. He waited until it lurched fully into the doorway, then drove the crowbar upward in a brutal arc. The steel met bone with a crack that echoed down the street, and the figure collapsed in a heap across the threshold. I kept my shotgun trained, scanning the street, ears straining for any response. Nothing came, only the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. We dragged the body inside, quickly shutting the door behind us. The interior of the house was dim, curtains drawn, furniture overturned, dust sat on the table, pieces scattered as if abandoned mid-turn. Harris muttered, "Family home? They never made it." His tone was flat, but I knew what he was thinking, what we were both thinking. How many houses like this stretched across the city? How many frozen moments of lives cut short? We didn't linger. We searched for supplies, found little beyond a few cans of soup and a box of matches, then moved on. The sun was lowering now, shadows stretching longer across the yards. Travel after dark would be suicide. We needed shelter, someplace secure, defensible. Harris suggested a 2-story brick house with intact windows and a heavy front door. We cleared it carefully, room by room, finding only dust and silence. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for the night. That evening, as we sat in the living room with a lantern burning low, I stared at the family photographs still hanging on the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, children in school uniforms, a couple embracing in front of Navy Pier. Ordinary people, lives once full of birthdays, arguments, dinners, laughter. Now their home was a tomb, and we were its squatters. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house sounded amplified. Every gust of wind through the chimney felt like movement. Harris slept lightly, his crowbar within arm's reach. I stayed awake longer, listening, wondering if leaving the tower had been bravery or folly. Out there the city waited, vast and unknowable, filled with dangers we could not yet see. But beneath the fear there was something else too. A pull I hadn't felt in years. The sense that moving forward, however dangerous, was still better than rotting in silence above a dead airport. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the story wasn't finished yet. But beneath the fear, there was something else too. A pull I hadn't felt in years. The sense that moving forward, however dangerous, was still better than rotting in silence above a dead airport. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the story wasn't finished yet. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams.